you have your perspective, because here in Poland, here in Europe, due to the Ukrainian war, we are starting to talk that China will invade Taiwan, China will do a war, prepare, and we will have another issue on the not only Hamas, not only Donbass, but also Taipei. We have new Chinese ambition, assertive China, being it Belt and Road Initiative, being it competition in space, being the Taiwan issue, being a competition for semiconductors and so on and so forth. So when Xi Jinping came out with his idea of Chinese Renaissance, America wake up, and we have a strategic competition.
So, I mean, all these people who talk about why China is not listening to Deng Xiaoping, I can tell you one thing. Deng Xiaoping was one of the wisest, shrewdest men that China has ever produced. I guarantee you, in 2024, Deng Xiaoping would say, we are now an elephant. We are not a mouse. So we must therefore get ready for the new reality of this China. And at the end of the day, remember, you and I can wish for a different world. But I can tell you that when you come from smaller countries, we cannot live according to our wishes. We have to live according to the realities.
What you just heard was a clip from a confrontation between veteran Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mahbubani and 3 Polish scholars, recorded in February of 2024. In an increasingly multipolar world, how will the West come to understand a rising China that is fundamentally different from itself? And in the eyes of China's neighbors, what does the growth of its power truly signify? In the content that follows, you will hear a deep dialogue on these core questions. Faced with a series of sharp inquiries from the Eastern European academics, Mr. Mahbubani, from an Asian perspective, provides a series of thought-provoking answers. He will explore the deep-seated reasons behind the shift in China's diplomatic posture from hiding its strength to striving for achievement. He will analyze the complex triangular relationship between China, Russia, and the West. And most importantly, on the Taiwan issue, he will offer a long-term prediction about its final outcome that is radically different from what is portrayed in the mainstream media. This is a dialogue filled with clashing perspectives, aimed at helping us understand the most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century. Let's continue.
We can say that one of China's biggest weaknesses is its sinocentrism, its Middle Kingdom complex. And now, when we look at Russia-China relations, we can see that China was able to restrain itself. But when we look at China's relations with others, it's not so. Since Professor Mahbubani is in Singapore, 14 years ago, there was a famous quote by Yang Jiechi, who said in Singapore, no, it was in Hanoi, but it was a reply to Singaporean foreign minister, that China is a big country and ASEAN countries are small countries, and this is a fact. So by this kind of actions, this reveals sinocentrism. And this is one of China's biggest weakness. So far, they were able to manage that, to handle that in relations with Russia, but not necessarily with other countries. And as for disruption, as for Krzysztof's question, I believe that the way Russia disrupts is in a way, it's in a way beneficial to China's interests, long-term interests, because Russia disrupts the Western world. It disrupts in Europe. It tests Europe. Sometimes the outcomes are not necessarily the one Beijing might wish to see, but nevertheless, Russia is challenging a common foe of China, and in this regard, these disruptions are not necessarily that detrimental to China's interests. So, in a way, it pays for China to have this spoiler, to have Russia as the spoiler, because then Russia can do many things which China doesn't want to do or which is unwilling to do in public. So in this regard, there is a sort of entente between China and Russia, and it's certainly not based on love. but it's based on mutual understanding and very strategic objectives. So in this regard, I believe that while these disruptions are not that negative for China.
If I can just address this question directly to Professor Mahbubani, because I think it's very interesting. Because to be honest, in the discourse in Poland and in the West, Iran and Russia are portrayed very frequently now as a kind of Chinese proxies. Are they? Are they Chinese proxies?
Well, I think China will be very happy if Russia and Iran were Chinese proxies. But I think the Chinese are the ultimate. We were talking of Mearsheimer and geopolitical realism. The ultimate realists of any country in the world are the Chinese. And by the way, this is an insight I got actually from Henry Kissinger. You know, I had two one-on-one conversations with him. One in October 2018 when I was writing my book on Has China Won. Then I saw him again in October 2022, about 1 year before he died. And again, he reiterated his views on China, which you can get, by the way. His book, which is called On China, is wonderful. I would recommend every Polish citizen to read it, because if they want to understand China, they should read Kissinger's book on China. And he explains how... And you should understand that, the Chinese always take the long view. You know, they're not interested in what happens next month or next year. At the earliest, they're thinking, what will the world be like 10 years from now? Or what will the world be like 100 years from now? And so, you know, that's why when give you a contemporary example, everyone says, you know, China has peaked, the China growth story is over, China is having lots of problems. Yes, it's having a lot of problems. But I'll take a bet with any of you that 10 years from now, China's economy will be much bigger. It hasn't stopped growing, right? Even though the Anglo-Saxon media thinks it has continued to grow. So I can tell you that from the Chinese point of view, if you want to understand the Chinese mind, the most important thing to remember is that the Chinese mind is conditioned by 4,000 years of Chinese history. Now, in 4,000 years of Chinese history, what is genetically embedded in their civilization is the realization that Chinese people do best when there's law and order and stability. Chinese people suffer when there's chaos, what they call luan. And so the Chinese hate chaos. So, you know, if this is why the conclusion of my book, Has China Won? If the United States can come with a sort of a geopolitical global framework that says, hey, okay, let's agree on a common set of rules. You can do well, we can do well, but let's agree on these rules. And if you offer any package deal to the Chinese that emphasizes stability, predictability, and order, they'll take it. They're not interested in having proxies like Russia or Iran or so on and so forth. And it's important to remember that at the end of the day, the Chinese will work with everybody. And that's why, as you know, China engineered the deal within Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, if Iran is their proxy, why are they linking Iran with Saudi Arabia? No, what they want is calm, stability, because China is also, as you know, now the world's largest trading power. And, you know, when the Houthis close the Red Sea channels, who suffers? Chinese suffer. There are more exports going through the Red Sea channel than United States does, right? So clearly the Chinese, if you give them a package deal that emphasizes predictability and stability, they will work with it. They will accept it. But you see, the reason why this is not possible yet, and this is why I say this very sadly, the United States is so focused on keeping China down that he doesn't focus on how to cooperate with China. And I think and by the way, I can tell you privately that Henry Kissinger agrees with me that what the United States needs is a long-term comprehensive strategy on what you want to achieve with China. Because today, what is unclear is that the United States is obviously taking all kinds of actions against China, tariffs on Chinese trade, suspension of chip exports, suspension of chip technology. But what's your end goal? What do you want to achieve? Are you going to try and get the Chinese Communist Party to collapse like the Soviet Communist Party? Maybe it can be done, but it cannot be done. I can assure you it cannot be done. So in fact, and paradoxically, the more pressure the United States puts on China and the Chinese Communist Party, the stronger China becomes. That's the paradox.
So before I give the voice to Professor Guralczyk, one clarification, because I think it's crucial to understand Chinese politics. Me personally, I cannot understand if Chinese is so focused on trade, why they are so passive in the crisis in the Middle East? Why they are not trying to make the trade route via Red Sea and Suez operational again? Why there is a Chinese base in Djibouti?
I can tell you very simply, the Chinese are the ultimate geopolitical realists, which means they know what they can do and they know what they cannot do. And they know they cannot. They understand the complexity of the Middle East very well. And so the best they can do, as you know, is to try and persuade the Houthis, don't shoot Chinese ships. And I think that they can accomplish. But trying to persuade the Houthis to stop shooting, they can't do it. And the Chinese, by the way, don't like to engage in military interventions. As you know, the United States often believes that the best solution is to either impose sanctions or bomb a country. And the Chinese don't believe in that. And the Chinese believe that you've got to try and find a pragmatic solution for all the challenges that you have. So, for example, as you know, China has a lot of challenges with Japan, huge challenges with Japan. But at the end of the day, they always find ways and means of working with each other quietly. Behind the scenes, something is worked out, and they continue. So that's what China will try to do. And since the Chinese government doesn't have to worry about elections, it doesn't have to worry about the headlines in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, it does what it thinks is the right thing for it over the long term, and not worry about what the next headline will say.
Professor Guralczyk, your intervention.
Yes, until now we are in harmony, time to arrange something of a kind of disharmony between us to be more entertaining. Professor Mahbubani, please make a statement after my intervention, what you think about what will be said. To my mind, we observe right now three another major shifts on the global scale. One was already raised by Michał Lubina. It is concerning China-Russian relations. You usually describe this relation in one Chinese proverb and sentence. They are sleeping in one bed, but have different dreams. So this is the explanation. No trust. However, there is a power shift there, because until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was Russia, later Soviet Union, as a big brother to Xiaohongxundi, to smaller brother in China. Now is vice versa. For how long? This is a major geopolitical question. And I suppose after Ukrainian war, after Mr. Putin, it will be top political issue on the global scale. And this is shift number one. Shift number two, which complicates our debate and also has another dimension towards the issue, has China won? is this geopolitical strategic change in American attitude towards China. Since Kissinger and Nixon opening for some 5 almost decades, we had the engagement. Instead of engagement, we have harsh, not even, but very harsh strategic competition and bipartisan in the US case. It was inaugurated during the Trump administration, is continued during the Biden administration. Of course, we had San Francisco summit, ceasefire, if I may so, for American election, but this is a structural clash. To keep it a strap, if you wish. This is why situation and the image of China in the Western world, in the global, to some extent, also in the global scene, has changed. And it is proved in public opinion polls. And this shift number 3, concerning China itself. I happened to be in China as the first Polish student out of 2 in the academic year 1979-1980, the first one after Cultural Revolution. So I do remember, as you do, from 1980, that everyone was bicycling, no one was even dreaming about the car. And right now, when I was in last November, just few months ago, completely different planet, not a different country. However, in this different planet, I would raise one issue, which is Deng Xiaoping heritage. Deng Xiaoping in August 1980 had a speech during the Political Bureau meeting, which was crucial. He was strongly attacking bureaucracy, the party. He was against the one-man rule. He was against engagement of the party into the production and market forces and so on and so forth. Very, very harsh words, which were valid for 1980s. And secondly, and you mentioned that in your previous book, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he used this constitution of 28 Chinese characters, Tao Guang Yang Hui, bide your time, conceal your capabilities, and avoid the limelight. And it was a Chinese strategy for 20 years, but not anymore. What has changed since Deng Xiaoping during the Xi Jinping era? New era, they say. First, Americans, Joe Biden says, America is back. In China, party is back. This is point number 1. Point number 2, one-man rule is back against the will of Deng Xiaoping. Point number 3, Deng Xiaoping, it was 实事求是, seek truth from facts, pragmatism, realism, as you say, ultimate sophisticated realists. But right now we have more and more ideology, including Marxism. And Marxism, by definition, is against market. So we have those issues on the top of the agenda. When you go right now to the bookstore in Beijing or Shanghai, you will see more Mao than Deng Xiaoping. This is something which is troubling. And finally, the most important thing. Instead of previous low profile, we have new Chinese ambition, assertive China, being it Belt and Road Initiative, being it competition in space, being the Taiwan issue, being a competition for semiconductors and so on and so forth. So when Xi Jinping came out with his idea of Chinese Renaissance, America wake up, and we have a strategic competition. So this is something which is complicating this current situation surrounding China. Absolutely, I agree, however, with your statement that they are ultimate realists. One important issue to be raised during our debate. Even during the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards didn't go to atomic bomb, thermonuclear nukes, which were exploded during the Cultural Revolution. So the interests of empire, fundamental interest. America says, well, let's make America again. Since Sun Yat-sen, through Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, through Mao Zedong, until Xi Jinping, they will say, let's make China big again. And that's why we have a problem, we have a headache, because the hegemonic power is clashing with the aspirant to be hegemonic power different way.
So, Professor Mahbubani, if you can just respond, is this vision of make America great again and make China great again to be negotiated?
Well, I can tell you that Bogdan made lots of points, other points in that. On the first point, when you talk about Russia and China, in your first point, I think I want to go back to a point that Michal made when he spoke about the yellow peril.
Yeah.
And I hope that my Polish friends will pay attention to this phrase, yellow peril, because that's an emotional dimension in international affairs too. And one of the things that's driving, in some ways, the United States geopolitical contest against China is the fear of the yellow peril, which I document in my book. And also, frankly, I think in Russia, there's an even greater fear of the yellow peril because Russians were actually invaded by the yellow peril. So
they have hidden it. They have concealed it. They have concealed it because they have buried their anxieties. That's quite important.
Yeah. You're right. They're completely, but it's real. And I think it's important for us, if you want to understand the complexity of our world today, we have to understand that there are deep wells of history in different parts of the world. We must understand the wells of history if we want to understand what's happening today, because whatever is happening today is not just because of what you and I are saying today. It's about what happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So, for example, in the case of China, the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949, none of us have mentioned it so far. That is the number one psychological driving force in Chinese minds. And you must understand the century of humiliation if you want to understand why China acts the way it does. And why did Deng Xiaoping have the 28 characters that Bogdan referred to, take a low profile, don't exhibit yourself and so on and so forth, because he wanted China to focus on growth and become strong. And Bogdan asked the question, why has China switched from, taking a low profile and becoming more assertive? Well, as I want to give you one statistic. In 1990, China's GNP, and by the way, just as an aside, let me mention, The Economist said in 1990, China's growth is over. 1990, the magazine. At that time, China's GNP was $360 billion. China's growth, the Economist said, growth story is over. And Deng Xiaoping said, take a low profile. Now, last year, China's GNP is now almost 18 trillion. It's gone up 50 times. Now, it's easy for a mouse to take a low profile. The mouse can hide under the table and people don't notice it. Now China's an elephant. Elephants cannot hide under the table. There's no table big enough to hide an elephant. So China, obviously, when it becomes 50 times bigger, it's not going to behave like a mouse. And by the way, all the Asian neighbors of China understand that. You know, if you live with a mouse, you behave in a certain way. If you live with an elephant, you behave a different way. Because when the elephant is sleeping and it rolls over, it can kill you. So you have to deal differently. And so it is unrealistic to expect that China will not become more assertive, will not throw its weight around as an elephant. But I want to emphasize that in English, there's a huge difference between two English words. And actually, I wrote a column in the Financial Times about this. One is assertive, the other is aggressive. China has become much more assertive. I completely agree, Bogdan. I mean, you're big, you know, you don't expect, if people don't treat you right. I can tell you, by the way, honestly, it's a true, simple story. When I was Singapore as a member of the UN Security Council, we went to visit 15 African countries in a chartered United Nations plane, right? And we arrived in the capitals, and of course, we discovered as members of the Security Council that the 5 permanent members were given special treatment. 10 elected members were not given special treatment. 5 permanent members were always seated with the VIPs, the post-government. One place we went to, I forget which country, African country, they made a mistake. They only put 4 at the head table, United States, Russia, UK, France, and they put China at the side table. I tell you, the Chinese ambassador went ballistic. What is this? I should be at that table. I'm China. I'm now number 1. And of course, I mean, it's fair. He's no longer a mouse. Come on. So, I mean, you know, all these people who talk about why China is not listening to Deng Xiaoping, I can tell you one thing. Deng Xiaoping was one of the wisest, shrewdest men that China has ever produced. I guarantee you, in 2024, Deng Xiaoping would say, we are now an elephant. We are not a mouse. So we must therefore get ready for the new reality of this China. And at the end of the day, remember, you and I can wish for a different world. But I can tell you that when you come from smaller countries, we cannot live according to our wishes. We have to live according to the realities. And that's what we have to deal with.
Talking
Yes.
about the elephants, because China is the elephant. I absolutely agree. However, if the elephant, China has the Taiwan issue open. When you are raising, quite rightly so, the 100 years of humiliation, like it or not, Taiwan issue is part of it. It is in Chinese psyche. Even in elementary schools, they are taught by one sentence: China is Taiwan is a part of China. Yes. So, do you have your perspective? Because here in Poland, here in Europe, due to the Ukrainian war, we are starting to talk that China will invade Taiwan, China will do a war, prepare, and we will have another issue on the not only Hamas, not only Donbass, but also Taipei. This is the issue which is discussed here sharply, and I would like to hear your perspective from Southeast Asia, which is more sensitive, closer, and you observe it. Talking about the elephants, we cannot escape the Taiwan issue, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. In
No,
fact,
fine.
as you know, Taiwan today is the last living symbol of the century of humiliation that China suffered from 1842 to 1949, because, as you know, Taiwan was first separated from China when China lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So for them, the separation of Taiwan is a memory of the Sino-Japanese War, and which is why, as you know, at the end of World War II, the Allies, I want to emphasize is the Allies, United States, Soviet Union, UK, France, all agreed that Taiwan belonged to China in 1945. People forget this point of history. And of course, as a result of the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan, and so Taiwan was physically separated. Now, clearly, if I can assure you of one thing, if the Taiwanese government declares independence, China will declare war. That's 100% certainty. But if the Taiwanese government is smart and doesn't declare independence, and I think they're not likely to declare independence, then China will not declare war. Because, in the case of the Chinese, and this is where you have to go back to Kissinger's book on China, the Chinese are thinking long term. Where will I be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? And where will Taiwan be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? China's position in the world will keep going up and up and up. More and more countries around the world are going to trade with China and be dependent on China. Now, all these countries, you ask them, you got to choose between China and Taiwan. They say, of course, I choose China. Why would I choose Taiwan? And so Taiwan will fall like a ripe fruit onto the lap of the Chinese in due course. But of course, if you have very dangerous people, and as you know, one dangerous person is someone like the former Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo, gave a speech publicly. I'm not inventing this. He said, United States should recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Now that's a declaration of war. So we need a lot of wisdom in this world to prevent wars. And I must give you all a very important statistic. That the amazing thing about East Asia, and in fact South Asia too, is that in our region, there has been no major war in 44 years since the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979, right? As you know, but Europe has had the Balkans War, the Ukraine War, and so on and so forth. So I think it's time for Europeans to reflect. Why is it that there are no wars in East Asia, but there's so many wars around Europe?
Yeah, I would just pose the question, which is after Taiwan, if the Chinese reunification would be full, I think the South China Sea and Northern India give some different perspective on this, because Taiwan is not the only part of the world with China's claim. But I would like to give the floor to Michał, who has his intervention.
Yes, I would like to, first of all, because since we should discuss about the book, but before I move back to the book, I would like to focus on Professor Mahbubani's words about no major wars in Southeast Asia, which I generally agree, but there is one exception, and this is Myanmar or Burma, because there has been a civil war in Myanmar since the very beginning of this country, and it's quite hidden it's not that well known outside of the country. Now we know after 2021 because it intensified, but the war has never stopped. So there was a war, and there has been a war continuing there, and as you remember quite well, Burma used to be called the Yugoslavia of Southeast Asia. So the comparison with Yugoslavia here is quite telling, and we'll see whether it will end up that way. But with that exception, I agree with the fact that Southeast Asia, after Americans quitted the region in 1975, which you write in the book, that's one of those selling points in this book, at least for Polish audience, because this is counterintuitive, that if America is no longer intervening in a region, then this region prospers. So this is one of the biggest assets for Polish readers, that this counterintuitive ideas would be there. However, I have one question or maybe hesitancy, and it's about Taiwan. Because the question is on whose side time is there. Because on one hand, like seeing from outside, I couldn't agree more with the fact that China will be more important, more influential, and so on and so on. That's clear. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that China is losing the battle for the minds of the Taiwanese, that the Taiwanese are getting much more distance towards China. There is developing self-identity. Some even say that a new nation is being born. and you know, well, the status quo for now is beneficial for Taiwan because it exists. So the question is that it will be China who will have to change the status quo this way or another. So since their policy of bringing or influencing Taiwan softly has failed to many extent, because DPP has won a third election in a row now in terms of presidential elections. So how do you, Professor, how do you look at that with this variable of Taiwan and Taiwanese identity, Taiwanese people, because this is in a way also a small nation?
Well, I mean, firstly, on Burma, you're absolutely right. There is a civil war going on in Burma. But I was referring to what I call interstate wars rather than civil wars. Because, you know, there are always civil disturbances in every country, you know, and they've been there, and that's a normal thing. But may there be no interstate war between two major interstate wars since 1979. And that's quite remarkable in a region full of lots of divisions. Now, on the question of whose side time is on, now you're absolutely right. The Taiwanese people do not want to become part of China today. That's very, very clear. You're absolutely right. But at the same time, don't forget that if the Chinese were going to have a maximalist demand and say that Taiwan should incorporate itself and become completely like China, and the Taiwanese people must change all their lifestyles and accept the Chinese Communist Party and so on and so forth, then I think that's a problem. But there have been lots of incredible number of signals from China that indicate that if Taiwan is prepared to indicate that it believes in one China, China is prepared to give the Taiwanese people all the autonomy they want to lead exactly the lifestyles that they have, travel around the world, choose their local government, do what they want to do, but say we are part of China. That's all. So all you need, frankly, what's amazing about the Taiwanese problem is that it is not difficult to solve. Not difficult to solve at all. Because the Chinese government doesn't need to have Chinese troops in Taiwan, Chinese police in Taiwan, doesn't need all that. It just wants to say, okay, you accept you're part of China, you can't join us now, never mind, but you say you're part of China and we will discuss when you can join. We can wait 100 years. So if that's the case, then there can be a solution.
But there's a third partner. We have not only two to tango, Taipei and Beijing. We have America, United States, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which is a description of Taiwan by the Americans. So it is a much more complicated issue.
Oh, I agree. But I want you to know that the most separatist leader of Taiwan was somebody called Chen Shui-bian. And you know, in the year 2003, Chen Shui-bian wanted to organize a referendum of the Taiwanese people to ask them, hey, would you like to be independent or would you like to be part of China? So he wanted to prove that the Taiwanese people wanted to be independent. And you know who stopped the referendum? It wasn't Beijing.
George W. Bush.
George W. Bush.
Of course.
So I want to tell you this. The Americans can be very pragmatic. In theory, the Americans love democracy. And they should have told Chen Shui-bian, we love you. Please let the people, let the people of Taiwan choose democratically. And George W. Bush, I can tell you, put incredible amount of pressure on Chen Shui-bian. Incredible. Because at that time, the United States needed China very badly after the American invasion of Iraq. And this is what all great powers do. They never put their values first, they put their interests first. And so today, it may be in the interest of the United States to push for Taiwanese independence. I don't know, but it meant to be fair. one reason why this year, I can tell your audience that in the year 2024, relations between US and China will be relatively speaking calm, okay? Because at the last meeting between President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in San Francisco, there was a very good meeting. And I understand that President Joe Biden gave a very categorical assurance to Xi Jinping that he supports a one China policy. And as long as the United States supports a one China policy, there'll be no war.
What we have just witnessed was a deep dialogue about China and its relationship with the world. In response to the sharp questions from the Polish scholars, Mr. Mahbubani provided a calm Asian perspective with a greater sense of history. In this exchange, their viewpoints formed a stark contrast and complement to each other. The Polish scholars focused more on the geopolitical challenges brought about by China's rise and the changes in its internal governance model, while Mr. Mahbubani placed these changes within a much grander historical framework for interpretation. In response to why China is no longer hiding its strength, Mahbubani used the analogy of a mouse and an elephant to attribute it to the inevitable consequence of China's immense growth in national power. On the Taiwan issue, he stepped outside the short-term narrative of military conflict, judging from a century-long historical dimension that, as long as there is no extreme external intervention, the issue will eventually be resolved peacefully. This conversation is so brilliant because it clearly showcases two different perspectives for observing China. One is a Western viewpoint based on current geopolitical anxieties, and the other is an Eastern viewpoint based on long-term history and civilizational evolution. It leaves us with several profound questions to reflect on. First, when a country's foreign policy shifts, should we interpret it as a sign of aggression, or should we first seek to understand the objective reality of the changes in its national power? Second, to what extent does the Western world's deep-seated historical fear of the Yellow Peril affect its objective judgment of China today? And third, regarding the final outcome for Taiwan, do you believe it will be resolved peacefully over time as Mahbubani predicts, or will it, as portrayed by Western media, inevitably lead to a military conflict? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We are eager to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this episode valuable, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.